Hello and welcome back. Today we're looking at Chapter 17, Section 2, Part 1, No Easy Victory. Chapter 17, Section 2 is a little bit on the longer side. There's a lot of stuff in it, so I decided to break it into 2 days because today we're going to be starting to look at, among other things, some of these specific battles that were being fought between the North and the South. But before we get into that, we will be looking at the strategies used by either side and how early encounters would show that this is not going to be a quick war or an easy victory. We talked a little bit yesterday about the South's plan to fight a defensive war, but we're also going to look today at the Northern plans for how they were going to ultimately win this war. But first, our key terms. And our key terms for today are the Battle of Bull Run, the CSS Virginia, also known as the Merrimack, and the USS Monitor. And those we will be talking about towards the end of today's lesson. But as we begin, we're going to want us to watch this first video because it's going to give a quick overview of the things we discussed in our previous lesson about the beginnings of the Civil War and this rush of the border states especially to try and take sides, and it will give us an idea of what both sides thought about the beginning of the war, about how this was going to be a very quick war. So we're going to watch that, then we will pick up with the Northern and Southern strategies.
Men rushed to answer Lincoln's plea for volunteers. But in the border states, Lincoln's call for volunteers forced a painful taking of sides. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, which until then had supported the Union, passed ordinances of secession and joined the Confederate States of America. Lincoln moved swiftly to hold the remaining neutral areas: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and the western half of Virginia, which had refused to secede with its state. But in those border areas, consciences were torn.
Two brothers on their way, one wore blue and one wore gray.
Numerous prominent Southerners like Robert E. Lee loved the Union and deplored slavery, but felt that their first loyalty was to their state. Lee said, "How can I raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home?" Lee had been offered command of the Northern forces, but he refused and cast his lot with Virginia. The South began the war with the expectation of a quick victory, largely because of its strikingly superior military talent. Southerners accustomed to hunting were excellent horsemen and marksmen. They were used to outdoor living, and they knew the terrain. Almost all of the fighting would occur on their own territory. The South's advantages led to early victories.
Yankee Doodle soon found out that Bull Run was no trifle, for if the North knew how to steal, the South knew how to rifle. Yankee Doodle wheeled about and scampered off at full run, and such a race was never seen as the one they made at Bull Run.
However, the North had its own advantages: enormous industrial capacity, fast-developing agricultural resources in the West, and a seemingly endless supply of manpower. Using these resources, the North developed a plan to strangle the Confederacy with a sea blockade, to gain control of the Mississippi River, to split the Confederacy along the Mississippi, and to capture the capital, Richmond. Following this plan, a strong Union fleet under the command of David Farragut helped capture strategic New Orleans in the spring of 1862, only 1 year after the war began.
Farragut came with a mighty fleet, 50,000 men had he, and the rebels made a hasty retreat before the first boat they could see.
Farther up the Mississippi, Northern armies led by Ulysses S. Grant made important gains.
In the east, Confederate forces under the leadership of Robert E. Lee and his right arm, Stonewall Jackson, frustrated every Northern attempt to capture Richmond.
The Yanks had forces twice our size, but at each attack they were surprised. For Jackson rides the lines and cries, "We'll hold them off at Richmond."
So the North and the South had very different strategies and very different plans for this war. We talked yesterday at our previous lesson about how the Southerners planned to fight a defensive war, and as we can see from this map, it can be referred to as an offensive-defensive. They could wait for Northern armies to attack and then drive them back into the North. And the Confederates believed that they could fight off the Union until the Northerners were just tired of fighting, and once the war became unpopular, then the North would be forced to accept the Confederacy. So, as we alluded in the past, if you think back to the American Revolution, this should sound familiar because it's basically the same plan that the colonists had when dealing with England. And it worked then, so it should work now. The North had a three-part plan. First, they would use their ships to blockade southern ports to prevent supplies from entering the South. Second, the Union hoped to very quickly capture Richmond, Virginia, which was the Confederate capital. And then third, they would seize control of the Mississippi to cut the Confederacy into two parts to prevent the movement of Southern troops and supplies, especially along the river. So, to review, Step 1, blockade southern ports. Step 2, quickly capture Richmond, Virginia. And Step 3, seize control of the Mississippi River.
Papers in the North began calling for a quick drive against Richmond, Virginia, which had been named the capital of the Confederacy. It was clear that the North expected a quick victory. The Confederate war aims were clear. They would attempt to defend their independence. Confederate strategy was clear too. Using the advantage of established defense lines, they would fight off any attempts by Northern armies to enter the South. Over time, Southern leaders argued, the North would be worn down by a war that was too difficult to win. For President Lincoln, the aim of the war was to preserve the Union. His strategy, therefore, had to be aggressive. His armies had to take Confederate territory, defeat Confederate armies, and topple the Confederate government. Toppling the Confederate government in Richmond, a mere 100 miles from Washington, where the Union Army of the Potomac was massing, seemed the easiest and most symbolic move, and it was quickly chosen.
And early on, the North was pretty successful with two parts of that plan. The first part was they were able to blockade southern ports, so trade with the South dropped by more than 90%. The Navy also moved to gain control of the Mississippi River. And when Union gunboats captured New Orleans and more ships seized Memphis, Tennessee, the Union now controlled the upper and lower halves of the Mississippi River. They basically encapsulated the South with the U.S. Navy. And at the same time, Union General Ulysses S. Grant led his army to victory during the Battle of Shiloh on the Tennessee River. And with that, the North slowly gained control of the western part of the Confederacy, and they were almost done with capturing the entire Mississippi. So A, they were able to blockade southern ports, and B, they were able to kind of cut off the western part of the South from the eastern part of the South. In the East, however, Union armies did not win any major battles during the first years of the war. And the first of the Confederate victories was the Battle of Bull Run. And what this battle did was it showed both sides that the war was not going to be won easily, but that it was going to be very long and very difficult. And there was a naval battle between the Confederate ship Virginia, which had been made out of the USS Merrimack, and the Union ship, the Monitor. And this battle at Hampton Roads actually ended in a draw. It wasn't a decisive victory for either side. And just as it hoped, the Union tried to capture Richmond, but they failed on multiple occasions. And following these victories in these battles, the Confederates went on to win the Battle of Fredericksburg, which was one of the Union's worst defeats in Virginia, and the Battle of Chancellorsville. But that was at great cost to the South's, at that time, best general, Stonewall Jackson, because he was killed at Chancellorsville. But I want to talk about those first two battles in a little bit more detail. The Battle of Bull Run and the Battle of Hampton Roads between the Monitor and the Merrimack, or the Monitor and the Virginia.
Lincoln's commander, General Winfield Scott, ordered General McDowell to cross the Potomac into Virginia. He was to seek out the Confederate Army defending Richmond, defeat it, and move on to the capital. So sure were the Unionists that their victory would be swift and decisive that they allowed sightseers to follow them as they hunted down the Confederate forces near Manassas Junction, Virginia.
On the afternoon of July 21st, 1861, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard looked through his field glasses at a column of soldiers advancing toward the battlefield at Bull Run, where fighting had raged since early that morning. General Beauregard could not tell if the approaching troops were Confederate or Union, but he knew that if they were the enemy, the day would be lost and he would have to order a retreat. A breeze swept across the fields and unfurled the flag at the head of the column. It was the Confederate Stars and Bars. These fresh troops attacked the right flank of the advancing Union Army at the same time Beauregard ordered the main rebel line to charge. The Union soldiers at that time heard, probably for the first time, a sound that would bring instant chills in the days to come. The 6,500 attacking soldiers let loose with a shrill, yelping fox hunter's call, an eerie trill that was to become known as the Rebel Yell. The onslaught was too much for the exhausted Union troops. Quote, "The enemy soon was forced over the narrow plateau, in disorder in all available directions towards Bull Run. The rout had become general and complete," said Beauregard. And Union Commander General Irvin McDowell explained, "The retreat soon became a rout, and soon degenerated into a panic. The disorganized mob of Yankees ran back towards Washington, sweeping along with them picnicking civilians and members of the U.S. Congress who had come out to watch the battle." That's right. These civilians and members of the U.S. Congress who had, quote, come out to watch the battle. Remember, people on both sides thought that this was just going to be a quick series of skirmishes and small battles, and eventually the other side would give in and everyone would go home happy. So there were spectators, just like this was a sporting event.
The spectators got a show, but it was not what they expected. The first important battle of the Civil War took place on July 21st, 1861, near a creek called Bull Run. Both armies were badly trained and poorly organized, but the rebels were much stronger than the Union troops expected. If a winner of this battle could be called, it was the South. But as the battle ended, they were no better off than the North. By Civil War standards, the casualties at Bull Run were low, but it was much bloodier than either side had expected. If they knew what was about to happen in the next 4 years of war, both sides might have tried harder to solve their differences with non-violent compromise.
General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson wanted to, but did not get the 5,000 men with whom he could move in and destroy the enemy. So in Washington, President Lincoln received a note saying, quote, "The day is lost. Save Washington and the remnants of this army. The routed troops will not reform." And if the Battle of Bull Run showed the Union commanders anything, it was that though they had superior numbers and munitions, the troops needed to be better trained to match the Confederate tactics and willpower. The Union casualties of that day were 460 men killed, 1,124 wounded, and 1,312 captured or missing, compared to the Confederate casualties of 387 killed, 1,582 wounded, 13 missing, but they were able to capture 28 cannons. So Bull Run, this is not going to be an easy war. The Battle of Hampton Roads. Now, often this is referred to as the Battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack, or the Battle of the Monitor and the Virginia, or colloquially, the Battle of the Ironclads. And this was a naval battle of the American Civil War, famous for being the first fought between two ironclad ships, or two ships completely coated in iron, the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia, which, as I mentioned before, had been rebuilt out of the burned-out hull of the USS Merrimack. And the main fighting took place on March 8th and 9th of 1862 off of Sewell's Point, a narrow spot where the James River empties into the Chesapeake Bay, and this area is known as Hampton Roads. And this naval confrontation spanned these 2 days, and during the first day, the CSS Virginia wreaked havoc upon the wooden Union ships that were blockading the harbor. But by the second day, the USS Monitor had initiated what has come to be known as this most famous duel of the ironclads. And the battle, though inconclusive, received worldwide publicity. And even though neither ship was sunk, the battle made it clear that ironclad, or that armored ships, were actually the future of naval warfare.
Saturday, March 8th, was wash day for the Union fleet in Hampton Roads, Virginia. Laundry was drying on the rigging of the Union warships when the Confederate Merrimack headed straight for the USS Cumberland. The Cumberland opened fire, but the shots bounced harmlessly off the Merrimack's side. The Confederate ship rammed the Cumberland, then stood in so close their muzzles almost touched. The Cumberland sank in shallow water. The Merrimack went on to set the USS Congress afire, drove the USS Minnesota aground, then drew back for the night. For one day, the Confederate Navy ruled the sea. At 1 o'clock that morning, the crew of the battered Minnesota saw a strange-looking ship draw up alongside them in the darkness.
Close alongside the Minnesota, there was a craft such as the eyes of a seaman never looked upon before. An immense shingle floating on the water with a gigantic cheese box rising from its center. No sails, no wheels, no smokestack, no guns. What could it be?
The Monitor had arrived. The next morning, the epic Battle of Ironclads began. Hull to hull, the two ships hammered away at each other, so close they collided 5 times as the men inside, half blind with smoke, loaded and fired. After 4.5 hours, the Merrimac drew off. It was her only fight. 2 months later, rather than surrender their ship, the Confederates blew her up when they were forced out of Norfolk. Both sides set to work building more ironclads, while Europe watched in worried fascination. From the moment the two ships opened fire that Sunday morning, every other navy on Earth was obsolete.
And I think this is a good place to stop for today. So tomorrow we're going to pick up talking about Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, and Antietam. There is no assignment associated with this particular lesson, but on the upcoming quiz, and especially in tomorrow's lesson, you'll need to be familiar with the meaning behind the Battle of Bull Run, and that it was the first major victory for the Confederate forces, and it showed both sides that this was not going to be an easily fought war, as well as the Battle of the Monitor and the Merrimac, or the Monitor and the Virginia, which was the first official naval battle between two armored ships, which showed that, again, this is not going to be an easy war, and B, armored ships were the future of naval warfare. And then, like I said, tomorrow we will pick up with our discussion of Antietam, Chancellorsville, and Fredericksburg. All right, have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the future.